this reflection. These are works bearing titles such as The Incarnation of the Son of God, dissertation connected with the Incarnation, The Lord of Glory, or more simply, Jesus Christ. They seek to expound, defend, clarify, or revise the way in which the Church understands the mystery of the Incarnation. The third element is the kenotic controversy. This refers to a theological debate of the 19th and early 20th centuries concerning so-called theories of kenosis. The term comes from the Greek verb in Philippians 2, verse 7, according to which Christ emptied himself. Certain theologians proposed a strong interpretation of this text. In order to become truly human, the eternal Son would, in some sense, have had to renounce certain divine attributes considered incompatible with authentic human existence, such as omniscience, omnipotence, or omnipresence. The aim was not to deny his divinity, but to conceive of the Incarnation as involving a real self-limitation. This proposal, the kenotic proposal, generated considerable controversy, not least because it seemed to weaken the divinity of Christ and maybe more fundamentally to call into question divine immutability. Finally, the two central figures of my research are Charles Gore and B.B. Warfield. Charles Gore was the leading Anglican defender of kenoticism. He developed a doctrine of Christ's double consciousness. Within the sphere of his incarnate existence, Christ lives authentically as man. Within the divine and cosmic sphere, the Logos continues to exist as the eternal Son. His aim was to safeguard the authenticity of Christ's human experience. B.B. Warfield was a determined opponent of kenoticism. He rejected any idea of an ontological renunciation of divine attributes. In response, he developed a doctrine known as the Gemena Mens. Christ possesses simultaneously a human mind and a divine mind, a human spirit and a divine spirit. The limitations observed in the gospel in Christ belong to his human mind, while his divine mind remained fully omniscient and omnipotent. As for the title of my dissertation, Between Tradition and Modernity, it seeks to express a structural tension. Tradition refers here to classical Christological dogma as formulated particularly at Chalcedon. Modernity refers to the new questions that emerged in the 19th century, historical criticism, modern psychology, and the questioning of certain metaphysical categories. Gore and Warfield are not simply positioned on opposite sides, one aligned with modernity and the other with tradition. Both stand between the two. Both claim a form of rootedness in the Christian tradition, and both are marked consciously or unconsciously by their modern context. My dissertation analyzes how this is the case in different ways for both theologians. The conclusion I draw is that this in-between situation is not an accidental weakness, but the normal condition of every theological work. I now turn to the second, more personal part of my presentation. This work has changed me. I began this research as a convinced partisan of Warfield and a determined opponent of Gore. Warfield was, so to speak, theologically my hero. Gore seemed to me to be the villain of the story. But the patient analysis of their texts gradually reshaped my judgment. I developed a critique of the biblicism and the relative lack of theological depth in Warfield's Christology. His defense of tradition now appears to me at times insufficiently attentive to the conceptual and metaphysical richness of the great Christian tradition. Conversely, I learned to appreciate in Gore his deep attentiveness to the ancient tradition. Far from being merely a modern innovator, he sought to answer new questions by drawing from the very sources of the tradition. In this sense, he appears as a precursor of a theology of ressourcement, retrieval theology, for which I now have great esteem. This journey led me to a broader conviction. It has become commonplace to say that all theology is historically situated. My work allowed me to grasp this concretely. Both Warfield and Gore are profoundly shaped by their context. But a theology that might be described as postmodern cannot content itself with observing that everything is situated. It must also recognize that explicit rootedness in the Christian tradition is often theologically fruitful. To justify one's claim, to avoid arbitrariness, to think with depth, recourse to tradition is not an obstacle, but a resource. My dissertation does not claim to offer a new Christological solution that would resolve all questions. Rather, it proposes a diagnosis. A theological work always unfolds between tradition and modernity. Learning to inhabit this tension with lucidity may be one of the enduring tasks of theological reflection. It is in this direction, I believe, that we must continue to probe the mystery of Christ. Thank you all for your attention.
Public session of the Doctoral Board of Propositions of the University with merciful God, clothed in wisdom, source of light and joy, we pray to you, grounded wisdom and insight, through Jesus Christ, in whom all treasures and wisdom and knowledge are hidden. Amen.
Amen.
Before I give the opposition the floor, the doctoral board gives you the floor, Mr. Pierre-Sylvain Joly, and the opportunity to publicly defend your thesis, I would like to welcome some guests in our midst. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Christophe Chalamet of the University of Genève, who is present online. Dr. Lydia Jaeger, University of Cambridge, whom I hope will be online, who was online a few minutes ago, but now isn't. And Professor Dr. Marcel Sarraut of the University of Tilburg. And we will start the opposition with Professor Marcel Sarraut. I give the floor to the first opponent.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rector. Esteemed candidate, let me begin by congratulating you on a PhD thesis, which, in my view, is in many respects exemplary. It's novel and interesting. I have found very few errors or mistakes in what you've written. And also, it may not be an example of self-emptying, but it certainly is an example of self-limitation. Moreover, I'm grateful to the Protestant Theological University that on this second or third day of Carnival, when my own Catholic university is entirely closed down, I have the opportunity to engage in theological discussion here. Now, as to my question, in the beginning of your book, you mentioned a number of criticisms of classical Christology, to which the kenoticist controversy in the writings of Charles Gore and Benjamin Warfield is relevant. One of these is that classical Christology presupposes an obsolete concept of God, according to which God is, among other things, eternal, immutable, and impassible. Later on in your book, you mentioned that this classical concept of God leads to a depiction of the incarnation, according to which the divine nature uses the human nature as an instrument. And you show that Charles Gore leaves the doctrine of divine impassibility behind. If I see well, however, both in the final chapter of your book and in the presentation you gave right now, you do not draw a conclusion on the criticism that the impassibilist concept of God is obsolete. You draw more general conclusions like all theology is historically situated and theology unfolds between tradition and modernity. But seeing that you're a dogmatic theologian, I would like to hear you say something not about theology, but about God. And I would like to invite you to explain to what conclusion one should come on the idea that God is impassible, the attribute of divine impassibility, on the basis of the research that you've done for this dissertation.
Most learned opponent, thank you for this really significant point you raised. As you may noticed, my dissertation seems to be merely descriptive, but somewhat it does carry a normative claim at some points. My dissertation was primarily analytical and comparative in method, but still the comparative analysis leads me to a broader theological diagnosis. And even though I did not say anything on the question of passibility or impassibility in God, I did write in the conclusion that we will do better to situate any Christological analysis within the context of a doctrine of God, both the doctrine of the one essence of God and the doctrine of the Trinity. As you may have noticed also in the footnotes, I quote sometimes Saint Thomas Aquinas. And during this journey, it was actually not the case at the beginning of the doctoral research, but I was more and more convinced by what has been known as the classical theism, and I have studied Saint Thomas Aquinas on my own alongside the doctoral study. So it was not the aim of the study to push for even Thomistic analysis of the doctrine of God, but my view that we should do Christology in a broader doctrine of God as its context means that I would say that it may be useful in a resourcement retrieval theology attempt to conserve, to keep with the classical doctrine of, for example, impossibility, aseity, and so on.
Thank you very much indeed. You stated in your presentation right now that Warfield initially was your hero and Gore was your villain. That's no longer the case, but you still do not follow Charles Gore then in leaving divine impassibility behind. And that's what I suspected already. But what I would like to hear from you, of course, is what your arguments are on the basis of the research that you've done. So why don't you follow Gore in this respect? If Jesus Christ is the highest revelation of God that we have, and if the suffering of Christ is central to the Gospels, what does this suffering of Christ tell us about God?
So the exact, dear most learned opponent, thank you for the new point and significant point you raised. The reason why, while being more sympathetic with Gore and not following him anyway, is that I think that although we should, like Gore and all kenoticist theologians, do justice to the real humanity of Christ, the incarnation is less understandable with no metaphysical claim behind. And the more I ponder and study this question, the more I think that in order to understand the incarnation, you've got to understand what is God and what is man, and you have to say that God is a mystery, and in some way this is what Warfield was not sufficiently able to do. It was not so much a mystery, and that's why he's not as much my hero as at the beginning, but still you've got to have some understanding of what is God, and in some way Gore has still a too human view of what God should be, like more a superhuman, that God almighty and all different of all creation. The difference between creation and creature is the first thing we should say about God. And so when we talk about God becoming man, we still have to say that there is the definitive creature, creator distinction we should maintain in any way.
Thank you very much.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Chalamet. I will try again in a different way. The opposition will be continued by Professor Chalamet, who obviously cannot hear me. Okay. unmute yourself?
Yes, no, I can hear you.
Oh, excellent. I invited
hear
you
me?
to continue the opposition. So please feel free to pose your questions.
If you can hear me, I will start.
We can hear you, but can you hear us?
I unmuted myself. I unmute.
Oh, excellent. I invited you to... Could you maybe pose your
Thank you.
questions? So please feel free to pose your questions.
Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate. I will start. So I would like to congratulate the candidate. I unmuted myself. There's a small delay. Okay. Unmute.
You maybe pose your
Thank
questions.
you. Yes. Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to congratulate. So on page 217, I would like to congratulate the candidate. The candidate there's a small delay. Writes the following assertion. He writes, yes. Le type de doctrine de Dieu que l'on adopte influe sur le type de christologie que l'on élabore ensuite. Writes the following assertion. He writes
Sort this out first.
le type de doctrine de Dieu in English que l'on adopte, if I translate, the kind of doctrine of God that one adopts influences the type of Christology that one subsequently
I'm sorry,
develops.
Mr.
But with the delay, that's what's happening. So he's posing the question, then it comes back to us, but via the live stream then resounds in his own system. We apologize.
Thank you, Rector. I will read the question by Professor Chalamet, which is, the candidate writes, the kind of doctrine of God that one adopts influences the type of Christology that one subsequently develops, page 217. Could you please comment on this statement, including in light of the history of Protestant theology? If what you assert is true, what consequences might this have for your own work in Christology? Who, since Warfield and Gore in Christian theology, seems to you to offer particularly fruitful avenues for contemporary Christological reflection, and why? Please comment and explain this assertion, also looking at the history of Protestant theology, with an emphasis on theo. What consequences this assertion may have on your own constructive work in the field of Christology, and who, since Warfield and Gore, presents particularly fruitful insights for Christology today, and for what reasons?
Opponent, thank you for this very precise question, which raises huge and very large avenue to ponder in. So I wrote that in this paragraph, I was commenting on Warfield, attributing to God divine simplicity, divine immutability, pure actuality, and using it against kenoticism. But it's the only time in all Warfield work I saw him mentioning this doctrine. He does not much with it. Whereas Gore developed a theory of divine sympathy, which is almost a kind of kenosis within God, God being willing to self-limit himself, either for creating the world and the creature, or to enter into a relationship with the creature, giving them freedom and so on. And so the claim I was making in this paragraph is that when you developed a theology of a self-limited God, willing to limit himself, then it is consistent with it to develop a Christology within the line of kenoticism. So, if now I should very quickly and delve into 20th century theology, I would say that more or less, and I put myself into it, we are all modern in the fact that most of us are not thinking metaphysically at all on every subject, and in this case not on theology. And the 20th century has been very strong on criticizing onto-theology, and it was more or less the dominant claim. We should do a doctrine, we should build a doctrine of God without the concept of being, or hence into it. I think that this is not totally useful for the project of building a theology, a doctrine of God for the 21st century. I understand why we don't do that, because each time I read into the medieval distinction, I have to rethink again, what does this mean? It is not at all easy to use it, but I think a ressourcement and retrieval theology here would be better when considering what the great medieval, since Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, have done in the doctrine of God in order to build this new theology for the 21st century. So my point is that in order to understand what being, or what God means even today, we still have to do the hard work, and it is not at all surprising, because God is such different from us. It should not surprise us that the work to understand or figure out what it should be, the hard work is still before us.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Jaeger. Professor Jäger, can you hear us? All right, then the opposition will be continued by Professor Benjamin.
Dear candidate, I would like to congratulate you with a very clear and well-structured dissertation that describes and explains the Christological positions of Gore and Warfield. You convincingly argue that, somewhat surprising, Gore cares more about tradition than Warfield, who mainly pays lip service to it, is quite modern in his own way. In your dissertation, you use the hypostatic union as a standard to assess the Christology of both Gore and Warfield, and you conclude that they both fall short of classical theology. Now my question arises as you take the hypostatic union, which was articulated at the Council of Chalcedon, as a standard. But you do so without discussing the patristic debates that underlie its formulation. The hypostatic union, as formulated by Chalcedon, can be regarded as a compromise between theologically different directions. As a compromise, that is, that succeeds in rejecting one-sidedness, but does not come up with a fully articulated theological position itself, and even a position that may be claimed to be impossible, and therefore was rejected by many modern theologians, Schleiermacher, for example. Before I pose the question, I would like to refer to your chapter 6, in which you say that the technical question of how the two natures are united is completely neglected by both Gore and Warfield. And you say, if they had used the classical tradition, their understanding of the hypostatic union would have been less rudimentary. But my question would be, if they had used classical tradition, they might have come up with opposed opinions and conflict instead of a more rich answer. So, my question is whether you should not have taken more account of the discussions and the different positions in patristics in order to clarify how Chalcedon and the hypostatic union can form the criteria for Christology.
Most learned opponents, you are absolutely right to point out the significance of this issue. My research was deliberately limited to the Christological construction of Gore and Warfield. However, if I may respond at the level of principle, I would say that researching on the debate within the different bishops who were at Chalcedon and even before Chalcedon could have been a useful way to give him even more depth to the research. And effectively, Gore does give long comments on the ancient council, even though, and many more pages than B.B. Warfield, but even he does not come with a definite view of what actually happened at Chalcedon. I think, but I'm not in my area of expertise with patristic history, that even the question of how to relate the different sources before and around Chalcedon to the decision of Chalcedon, even theologian historian do not all agree on what kind of compromise it was. I read different authors' mainly in French, but who do not agree on what kind. So I have not a definite idea of what was really concretely at stake between the different parties, but still it would have been an avenue to enter in to give another angle to my research.
Yes, I understand. But the point is, and that makes a bit of a problem to me, that given these discussions, you still use the hypostatic union as a clear criterion to assess both Gore and Warfield, and how to keep up the criterion if there is so much discussion about it.
Most learned opponent, I understand the points you raised, but in this case of Gore and Warfield, the two of them always agree to speak of the union of nature. So even though they did not delve into what it actually means, they would not have tried to discuss even the notion and try to found a new solution aside of or out of the theory or doctrine of the hypostatic union. So I do not say that every question in the Christological debate today will be solved by understanding more fully what the hypostatic union means in the ancient and medieval tradition, but with these two theologians who globally agreed with the Chalcedon project, I think that if they have done the distinction found in Thomas Aquinas and later theologian, they could have agreed between them somewhat more than what they do.
The opposition, I hope, will be continued by Dr. Jaeger. Can you hear us, Dr. Jaeger? This doesn't bode well. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Bohm.
Dear candidate, thank you so much for your study. I think you did a good job here, and especially you shed new light on B.B. Warfield. I think that's important here. In reading and understanding your study, I struggled a little bit with the way you try to work both contextually and historically and more systematically. I have two questions on that, and first we do the first one, and we'll see afterwards if there is space for the second one. So the first one is about the more contextual, historical struggle I have. On page 216, I quote, you say qu'il s'agisse de critiquer les inadéquations possibles de la formule de Chalcédoine ou qu'il s'agisse au contraire de la défendre, il n'est pas tout à fait compréhensible que nos deux théologiens n'aient pas su articuler et expliciter des concepts christologiques tels que communication de la substance du Fils éternel à sa nature humaine, l'assomption de la nature humaine par la personne du Fils, la nature humaine comme l'instrument ou encore le Fils comme personne composée. For me, specifically, il n'est pas tout à fait compréhensible is a little bit a deception. And I was asking reading your work, what is exactly the motive that both theologians who are so dedicated to tradition cannot use these concepts. So what is in its context that justifies not using these kind of concepts that are so substantial for the tradition?
Learned opponents, thank you for this very precise question on Gore and Warfield. When I wrote that it was not understandable, compréhensible, I think it was mainly a quite polite way to say that I disapprove the fact that they did not. Not actually that I did not understand or suggested why. This paragraph do refer to the same chapter 6 on the hypostatic union we just discussed some minutes ago. And I think that this is in this chapter that I may have given clues on why this happened not only in Gore and Warfield, but actually in most of the theologians of the 19th century, but even more in the 20th and 21st century. And the main reason, even though it is not the only reason, the main reason will be, in my opinion, that we do not live anymore in a metaphysical century, and that we are not patient with the kind of distinction that the medievals patiently works through. So this will be in a post-Kantian, post-Hegelian centuries the main reason why I think we could understand this defect in their Christology and theology.
Yes, I understand you say that from hindsight, but how could they themselves defend? How did they themselves defend that? So what was their contextual justification, so to say? Because they didn't use that kind of explanations, did they?
Learned opponent, thank you for raising this point. I think that they do not answer this charge at this point because the context itself, and they were different. One was English and Anglican, the other was Presbyterian and American, but still the zeitgeist was somewhat the same on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And I think that maybe not much theologians were raising question about the non-metaphysical shape of theology at this time, because it was the atmosphere of all the century. And aside from Thomistic theologian, which were not, there was not already the Thomistic revival of the beginning of the 20th century. There were not the Dominican theologian which were retrieving Thomism. There was not much theologian willing to ask metaphysical question to non-metaphysical arguments. I think so.
We have a custom that once we have heard all the opponents, or some haven't heard, we continue at the beginning with the opposition. So I give the floor once more to Professor Sarro.
Thank you very much. Esteemed candidate, one of the merits of your book is the attention you devote to the methods applied by Charles Gore and Benjamin Warfield to the questions they are discussing. Now, in light of this attention to method, it comes as somewhat of a surprise that you do not explicitly reflect on your own method or methods. In your research project, you interpret two theologians and compare their views. That presupposes a view on hermeneutics, the theory of interpretation. Could you reflect on the methods applied in your own book, both in the interpretation of the authors that you analyze and in your constructive suggestions at the end of your book?
Most learned opponent, thank you for this fundamental question of methodology. Obviously, behind every assertion, there is a presupposition and method, and I do not pretend to be an objective commentator of the question. I even wrote somewhere that and I said it in my presentation today, that the aim was not only to say that every theology is situated, but in order to bring forth a postmodern theology, we have both to be aware of our own preconceived and presupposition behind what we are saying and writing, but also try to justify with the best we can the different assertions we are making with this presupposition behind. So my aim, and I hope method in the dissertation, was to give attention to the context of both theologians, but by this journey, it makes me more attentive to my own context with my own preconception and presupposition, and what may be the more fruitful for my own research with this book and is trying to be the more aware of where I am standing and what I am standing on the back of this preconception and presupposition.
Does this mean that if you would write the book again, you would write it much more in the style of contextual theology? Because you focus on the context of your authors, but you do not really focus on your own context.
Most learned opponent, thank you for the question about what I would do now. And it gives an avenue on the future, which is giving me a joy, actually. I am not thinking that it is always useful to give every secret of your recipe when you are cooking for anyone. And so when, or if I write another book, I will maybe not give all the method I want to apply in my book, but I will try to be as focused on what I aim to do. When I teach dogmatic theology, I do the prolegomenon on the last semester because students find it boring at the beginning, first. And second, I'm not sure they can understand what we are doing methodologically before we are starting to do concrete theology. And so we do the introduction to the method of theology at the end. So maybe if I write a book where I give my method, I will give it in the annex, in the addendum at the end of the book.
Thank you.
being an avid cook myself, I'm not sure I agree. I would be willing, if the meal is nice, I'm quite willing to share the recipe. We will now continue the opposition again by Professor Chalamet, but by word of mouth, no. Then we will continue by Professor Benjamins.
Yes, okay, thank you. Dear candidate, listening to you, I was just wondering, which is not precisely in the book, I think, but I was wondering, you mentioned on the one hand that we live in a post-metaphysical era, and on the other hand you talk about post-postmodern. And now my question is post-postmodern metaphysical again, or what is the relation between our non-metaphysical era and post-postmodern? Could you please give some explanations about that? It would.
Most learned opponents, you are absolutely right to point this issue. So the way I use postmodern, I did not invent this language. The way I use postmodern is to say we live in a postmodern world, and the time is of postmodern theology, but we may not be content with it. And so postmodern theology is somewhat a way to react or to learn both from postmodern theology and from more ancient theology, and to resource it, to retrieve the past, but with the question of the days. So it is not necessarily metaphysical, because the postmodernity is post-metaphysical, but we may try to put some ingredients of metaphysics in the new postmodern theology. So it's not a definition, because it does not exist as a known theology. There is not a school known as the postmodern theologians, but if we are not totally satisfied with postmodern theology, we may try to retrieve and even learn from metaphysicians from the past.
Yes, okay, thank you for your answer. That is pretty clear in a way. But let me ask you once again to, well, you may not like the question, but postmodern with a bit of metaphysics, is that metaphysic or postmodern?
Most learned opponent, I must confess that I'm not totally sure what to expect from the future. I would say that it's sure that there will be something after postmodernity. I'm not that sure it will be metaphysical. So maybe it will be post-metaphysical, if you understand what I mean.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Klaas Bom.
Yes. I just continue with my struggling with the historical dimension and the systematic dimension of your study. You relate Warfield's and Gore's modern theological proposals to what appears to be a timeless and contextless Christian tradition. Upon closer inspection, this primarily concerns the scholastic processing of classical Christological dogma, which took place in various historical contexts and in which different movements and schools advanced different positions. Well, this is somewhat vague in your presentation of this Christian tradition, and for my understanding, you select Thomas Aquinas without a lot of
The doctoral board has heard your defense and will withdraw to deliberate. This session is suspended.
check 1, check 2. Check 1, check 2. A take.
The session is resumed. Mr. PhD candidate, the doctoral board has reviewed your dissertation and has heard your defense. The board has decided to award you the doctorate. I now invite the promoter, Professor Maarten Wisse, to confer this dignity upon you in the customary fashion.
By virtue of the authority granted to us by law, and according to the decision of the doctoral committee present here, I hereby declare you, Pierre Sauvin-Chauny, to be promoted to doctor, with all rights and responsibilities attached thereto by law and tradition, with respect to science, church, and society. As a proof of this, I hand you the diploma, signed by the rector and promoter, and sealed with the Great Seal of the university. Dear Dr. Chauny, the milestone has been reached. A journey that spanned 12 years has come to an end. And let me be clear from the very outset, the fact that it took almost 13 years before we could experience this moment together was by no means due to your intellectual qualities, Dr. Chauny. In fact, whenever a text was submitted, it was always a good text, an excellent text. The obstacles on the path to this moment did not lie in your skills as a theologian or a researcher, quite the contrary. You can be very proud of the final results. You have succeeded in refining the stereotypical image of two authoritative theologians on key points, presenting them as children of their time, without relativizing their theological convictions or their commitment to the Christian tradition. One of these theologians is B.B. Warfield, a figure held in high esteem within your own tradition. By placing him precisely within his historical context and revealing his modernity, you have given yourself and the tradition you represent the opportunity to see Warfield as a 19th century theologian, rather than as an axiomatic champion of a timeless orthodoxy. This creates space to recognize his limitations and to rethink for our own time the tradition of which he considered himself a heir. But if it wasn't a lack of intellectual quality, why did it take so long for the dissertation to be completed? It was due to a variety of factors. One of them, I believe, was intellectual ambition. When Pierre Sauvin first spoke with me in 2013 about a potential doctoral project at the Free University, where I was still working, he clearly indicated that he wanted to do more than what he had done until then, particularly on a methodological level. He became fascinated by the approach of systematic theology as scriptural reception that I was working with at the time. This is how the project on Christology initially arose, based on the idea that it would be possible to map the Christology of Warfield and Gore through the lens of their reception of Scripture. However, it took you, Pierre Sauvin, considerable effort to translate the ideas and sometimes the intuitions of your supervisor into a concrete analysis of the material. Yet that was certainly not the only reason for the delay. During this 12-year period, 3 children were born: Augustin, Eleonore, and Celestine. The time Pierre Chauvin could devote to the dissertation alone proved shorter than planned. This brought with it a heavy teaching load and a move from Paris to Marseille. And then came the COVID crisis. That didn't help, to put it mildly. What ultimately helped a great deal was a second supervisor with a somewhat different character than the first. Arnold Huygen joined the project as the second supervisor and had a very effective way of getting Pierre Chauvin to work. In hindsight, I perhaps showed too much understanding for the delays that occurred, which didn't always optimize the pace. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to deeply thank my colleague Arnold Huygen for his involvement in the project, an involvement that certainly went much further than just boosting the work rate. A more pragmatic approach also helped to bring the project to completion. Once the complex methodology of scriptural reception was removed from the project, a new project emerged regarding the role of modernity in the theology of both Gore and Warfield. This allowed much of the existing material to be rewritten and reused, which improved the momentum. The rest is history. Hardly any PhD project passes without major or minor hiccups. Nevertheless, during an intellectual journey such as this, one always learns much that proves valuable for a later academic career. I sincerely hope that is the case here as well. And I hand over now to my colleague to continue in French.
Finalement, quelques mots en français. Le français, c'est ma tâche du côté des professeurs aujourd'hui. Madame Chauny, Audrey et les enfants, Augustin, Éléonore et Célestine, vous aussi été impliqués dans la genèse de cette thèse pendant 12 ans. Bien sûr, cela n'a pas toujours été facile. Nous vous remercions pour votre persévérance et patience qui ont permis à ce projet d'aboutir. D'une certaine manière, vous avez aussi, vous aussi, obtenu votre doctorat aujourd'hui. Et c'est pourquoi je vous adresse mes plus sincères félicitations. Enfin, j'adresse nos félicitations à la faculté d'Aix-en-Provence. La faculté peut être fière de son nouveau docteur. Nos institutions diffèrent sur nombreux points, mais nous sommes tous les deux fidèles à la tradition de la Réformation, la tradition évangélique, et nous sommes unis dans le service du Dieu vivant. Merci.
Most learned sir, also on behalf of the doctoral board, I congratulate you on the dignity that you have obtained. I now invite you to sign the album. I will now conclude this session with the doxology. I ask all of you to rise. The Almighty God, by whose light we see light, to him be the glory forever and ever. Through Jesus Christ. Amen.